For Bianca Jones, this was meant to be the trip of a lifetime.
Bianca wanted to explore the world, meet new friends. Her life had just begun. She was a young woman that had a lust for life.
But it turned into her family's worst nightmare.
A young Australian woman died today, the sixth foreign tourist to lose their life in Laos in Southeast Asia from suspected methanol poisoning.
All the deaths are believed to be connected to bootleg alcohol.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade has warned New Zealanders travelling to Laos in Southeast Asia to be cautious when drinking alcohol.
The Australian Federal Police have offered to work with Lao authorities, and travellers have been warned about the risks of drink spiking.
19-year-old Bianca died in a suspected mass methanol poisoning in Van Vieng, Laos. At the time of recording this podcast, she was one of 6 foreigners to have died. Several more remain in hospital, lucky to be alive. Yesterday, 8 men were detained.
A local media site is reporting staff aged between 23 and 47 from the hostel at the centre of the tragedy are in custody.
When foreigners are poisoned abroad, it's big news. But according to Doctors Without Borders, methanol poisoning isn't as rare as we might think. This month alone, there have been 6 incidents affecting nearly 200 people and killing more than 80. Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and on The Detail today, how methanol poisoning affects the body, how it ends up in drinks in the first place, and what to do if you accidentally ingest it.
I was violently throwing up, I had visual impairment, like I could barely see, it was just like bright lights.
It's sometimes added to drinks because it's cheaper than alcohol.
As little as 25 millilitres can be fatal, and prompt treatment is key to survival.
But just how easy is it to seek that prompt treatment when you're in a foreign country, sick and unable to speak the language?
Laos is extremely mountainous, so you're going to have to get from the center of Laos south to Vientiane. That's a 3-hour drive, and then Vientiane get to the airport and charter a plane or get on a plane for an hour, at least hour and a half, to fly to Bangkok, and then get off the plane and then go to a hospital in the city. And that's, maybe you're sitting in traffic for another hour.
Erin Hale is a freelance journalist who's currently based in Taiwan. But having spent time in Laos, she paints me a picture of how easy it is for a tourist trying to seek medical care in Van Vieng. In short, it isn't.
Van Vieng is a very popular town for backpackers. It's kind of in the middle of the country. It's popular because it has a river that goes through it. So a lot of people like to go tubing there. And it's just kind of built up a reputation as somewhere that's a little bit more relaxed in a country that's still very traditional and also very communist. So things are very controlled. There is a clinic there where you can get medical treatment if something goes wrong. But my guess is they're probably mostly dealing with tourists who fall off their scooter, maybe tourists who get dehydration, maybe dysentery, and then probably treating local people for stuff. They're probably pretty good at delivering a baby, but I would think that they're not going to be so used to something as different as methanol poisoning.
And is there also a language barrier there? How well is English spoken?
I would say that English is not that widely spoken in Laos. I would guess because Van Vieng has so many tourists, whoever the medical personnel is on duty there probably speaks a little bit. But again, they're not going to I would guess they probably wouldn't have advanced knowledge or maybe advanced terminology to know what's going on. Big issue in a lot of these countries is not just the medical care, it's also the labs. So if the labs aren't doing their work as well, the doctors don't necessarily know what's going on. And I've had this experience where I basically had dengue. The test came back negative. And the doctor was just like, I'm going to ignore this. You have all the symptoms. And I remember just talking to people. They're like, yeah, the labs here are they're not run at the same standard as, in the West. And that will just give you weird indications. And if the doctor is just following what the lab says, that's going to create a problem.
Interesting. So you're saying that the doctors are sending blood tests and urine tests to laboratories and they're coming back with false answers? False results?
Yeah, that can happen a lot. Maybe not in this case, but that is relatively common, I think, in Cambodia and Laos. So that just adds another layer of problems to getting medical treatment. And that's why in most cases, anytime anything gets serious, they'll be like, please just go to Bangkok or Singapore.
And so someone who is a tourist, who is, in this case of methanol poisoning, very unwell, How easy is it to navigate their way to somewhere to get the right care?
I think Vang Vieng is particularly hard because it's just like probably one or two small clinics. So it would be challenging because you'd have to go there and then they'd probably want to send you to a bigger regional hospital, which should be something in Vientiane. And then in Vientiane, if they decided it was serious, they want to send you on to Bangkok. So this could be like an entire day plus of travel and just movement. And that's, while you're feeling extremely unwell. So it can be very challenging to navigate.
Are these transfers you have to organise yourself, or do they have, like we have, the St. John's ambulance service?
I would say you probably have to organize them yourself until you got to a regional hospital. If they wanted to send you to Bangkok, they would probably potentially fly you in a helicopter or maybe a more immediate vehicle. But you would have to organize that probably with the help of your insurance company. So that would get pretty complicated. But going from Vang Vieng, let's say back to Vientiane's hospital, you would probably need to organize like a private car. The roads are better now, but it's still like a 3-hour drive. It would be pretty rough. And, my guess is also that, things like dehydration are so common there and it's so easy to get hangovers when you're already dehydrated. It's very possible that I'm just thinking that the medical staff are probably like, oh, this is just a case of kids who went too far.
And obviously medical intervention for methanol poisoning is essential. But in these latest cases, it seems to be that the victims didn't seek that medical attention. Why do you think that could be or is?
I think they probably just didn't know what it was, because when you're traveling and you're backpacking through a country like Laos, you can just get hit by so many different things. Maybe it's, again, like really severe dehydration can feel horrendous. Maybe they thought they might have the start of something like dengue. It's even the people they interviewed. I saw in some of the news articles, they interviewed some foreigners living in Vang Vieng or the area. They had never heard of it. So I think it's just that even before you go on a trip, you need to be aware that this could be a problem.
Fortunately, I've had to give quite a lot of interviews about methanol in the last week. It has been quite surprising to me that there's quite a lot of young people were unaware of this and unaware of the seriousness of it as well.
But that knowledge is not just lacking in the younger generation. David Ranson heads the Department of Forensic Medicine at Monash University and says the lack of awareness about the dangers of methanol across the board is quite confronting.
This has existed for decades and decades and decades. We've known about this and we've been managing these incidents around the world for a long, long time, but it hasn't reached that level of public awareness.
Methanol is a type of alcohol. It's used in solvents, paint thinners, and some fuels. The alcohol we drink in beers, wines, and spirits is ethanol. They both smell like alcohol and are clear and flammable, but the way the body reacts to them is very different.
Not only is there a chemical difference between the two, but ethanol will break down in the body to a number of products which we can get rid of quite easily. And whilst they're not exactly pleasant and they can give you a bit of a hangover and things like that, they're not usually terribly serious unless you take enormous amounts of ethanol. However, methanol is a bit different because when it breaks down into some very nasty chemicals in the body. Chemicals like formaldehyde, or an embalming fluid essentially used in pathology labs to preserve tissues and things like that. And then from formaldehyde it goes down to formic acid. Formic acid is a very, very nasty acid inside the body, and it actually attacks the way our cells effectively breathe or make energy. And so it really acts to limit the ability of cells to make their energy, and as a consequence cells die. The result of that, of course, is that many, many organs in the body become seriously damaged. And one of the tragic things is that people with this degree of poisoning can actually lose their vision, go blind, have quite serious problems with internal organs. And the results in an untreated case or in very late treatment in a case can indeed be fatal. And, people have put fatality rates. It depends on obviously how much people have drunk and how quickly they got treatment, if at all. But, it can be sort of 20, 30, 40% fatalities.
I mean, I want to get to the symptoms of methanol poisoning in a moment, but first I want to talk about how and why it's ending up in people's drinks in the first place, if it is so deadly.
Yes, look, there are probably a number of circumstances around the world where methanol appears in people's drinks. And some of them are, if you like, accidental, and some are probably, well, not necessarily deliberate, but inadvertent. Sort of natural ways in which we get methanol, and a lot of things that we consume do have tiny, tiny amounts of methanol in them, which our body is able to deal with very quickly and very easily. But certain home brews, certainly in a number of countries where, say, a village will make their own brew and they will do their own fermentation, they can ferment some drinks in a way that actually creates a lot more methanol as well as ethanol. And that can be very, very dangerous. And therefore, you get what's called a sort of an outbreak of methanol poisoning. I think it's more related to fruit spirits and things like that rather than grain spirits. But it's a different sort of fermentation. And modern countries with modern commercial productions, they tend to make sure that the methanol that might be made in a fermentation is filtered out. However, the other form of methanol poisoning that does seem to occur again in outbreaks around the world is a situation where people add methanol to drinks, presumably to maintain their appreciated strength, if you like, but also to make the drink go further. That obviously would increase profits and things like that. They may add methanol to a brew that they have made to sell, because effectively you can buy methanol, which is a sort of industrial solvent, really very cheaply, whereas doing a proper commercial brewing of a refined ethanol alcohol drink is much more expensive to do. So there's, if you like, a sort of a commercial imperative to perhaps add a little bit of methanol to a range of drinks in order to stretch them and make them go further. And of course, that is the situation which is really very, very dangerous. One of the problems of methanol is that because you can't really detect it when you're drinking, it's colourless, odourless, and so on. The person drinking the drink doesn't know that it's got methanol added. And indeed, it may have methanol in the drink as well as the alcohol in the drink.
Drinking a mixture of methanol and ethanol can delay symptoms of methanol poisoning. That's because ethanol actually stops the body from breaking down the methanol.
When you have alcohol in the body, there's an enzyme in the body, alcohol dehydrogenase, that breaks that alcohol down. And in the case of methanol, it breaks it down to these very nasty compounds, formaldehyde, formic acid, and things like that. Alcohol dehydrogenase prefers to work with ethanol, the normal alcohol that we drink, rather than dealing with methanol. If you can keep the alcohol dehydrogenase busy breaking down ethanol, then it can't break down the methanol. One of the consequences of methanol being blocked by ethanol from being metabolized is that methanol poisoning comes on later, where a person's had a drink containing ethanol which has also been contaminated with methanol. So in other words, the body starts off breaking down all the ethanol, and it's only later on, once the ethanol has gone, that it starts to break down the methanol, and then the person becomes poisoned. So it's not uncommon for people to present with methanol poisoning a good day or so after the drinking episode.
And this can actually be life-saving. David says doctors will treat patients with methanol poisoning by giving them a stream of low-dose ethanol alcohol.
If you keep giving the person a low level of alcohol, that is ethanol, then hopefully they can get rid of the methanol by putting it out in their urine and things like that and breathing it out so that it never gets converted to those really nasty products like formic acid.
But that's just one of a number of methods used to treat what he describes as a complex and dangerous medical case.
It's a complex procedure. It includes things like dialysis, a range of other drugs being given to reverse some of the effects. You cannot treat yourself.
Yeah. Are the symptoms of methanol poisoning easy to confuse with a normal hangover, or are they quite distinct?
Well, there's an overlap, and then there are things that are really quite distinct. Many people having taken too much ethanol and having a bit of a binge drink will have a whole variety of symptoms. They may feel dizzy and giddy and unstable. They may have nausea and some vomiting. And all of those things can also occur with methanol. Indeed, methanol is an intoxicating alcohol in its own right. However, because it causes cell damage and significant cell damage when it's broken down to formic acid, you start to get other symptoms which are not what you'd expect with alcohol. You're going to get more than just a headache. You're going to get blurred vision. You may actually go blind. You may have seizures. People often complain in the earlier stages of abdominal pain and chest pain, things that are not the sort of things you expect to have with a normal hangover from having too many ethanol-based alcohol drinks.
David, how long does someone have before methanol poisoning becomes fatal?
Well, it just depends on so many things. The reality is it's going to depend on the actual dose they've taken, how much, what level of symptoms they have, how fast they get to hospital and start definitive treatments.
And those who are lucky enough to get to a hospital, get the treatment and do survive, are they fine or do they suffer long-lasting damage?
There can be long-lasting effects. Certainly vision effects and blindness and so on have been reported that some of those effects will not be reversible. So permanent harm can result. And indeed, some of the symptomatology, people who have prolonged seizures or something like that, may not do well.
All of the victims in this latest case were tourists. Is it most commonly tourists who are affected?
It's not necessarily mostly tourists, given that some of the other situations occur where you have communities doing their own brewing for a celebration event or something like that. But certainly where alcohol is being pushed for sale and there's a big industry in supplying tourists with cocktails and drinks when they're traveling and things like that, then obviously the actual volume, if you like, of sales means that people want to perhaps stretch the alcohol so it'll go further, and there may be a group of people who are more likely to be taking that sort of alcohol. That could well be tourists and travellers.
And that industry supplying bars with cheap alcohol so they can offer customers free shots is flourishing. The advice given to travellers is to only drink from a bottle you see being opened so that you know that it's safe. But Australian methanol campaigner Colin Ahern says that's not enough.
They will mass produce spirits. They have nice little stickers for brand new bottles with nice little caps. They've even got the government import label over the top of the bottle. You could not tell the difference if you were paid to.
Colin has a Facebook page called Just Don't Drink Spirits in Bali. He started it in 2018, mainly to help educate people about methanol poisoning. He says he's helped over 200 people who've contacted him for advice. He's not a doctor who's medically trained in treating methanol poisoning.
I'm a tradie. I'm a country boy. I'm a dad. I'm a granddad. I'm just a tradie that's listened and learned.
And he wants to help educate and advise.
Some of those people that ring up are just panicking beyond belief and just paranoid. Quite often I'm just a counselling tool where people are absolutely panicking. They're packing the big ones and they think, I'm going to die of methanol poisoning. Now, of course, the anxiety that's caused by that can be worse than what's actually going on. So a lot of times it's just purely trying to calm people down, listen to their story, listen to what they've drunk, listen to their symptoms and go, look, I know you're not well. I don't think what you're telling me is methanol poisoning. I think you do need medical attention, but I don't think it's going to be this. The other side is where I find people that are in more shit than Ned Kelly. You know, they are in big trouble and they need some help now.
Colin has also become a safe haven for people who have been poisoned by the substance.
There's still a Canadian guy that I'm in contact with from a couple of years ago. They had a welcome drink at where they were staying. He still has cognitive issues. He's a medical student. He had tunnel vision for a good while. His vision comes and goes, but he still, if he has a normal drink over in Canada now, which is perfectly safe over there, he still gets flashbacks and he still gets effects.
And then there are the families of people who didn't survive.
You guys would be familiar with Liam Davies when he passed away 11 years ago.
Liam Davies was all set to cap off a big 2012 with New Year's Eve on Indonesian island Gilitee. At Rudy's pub with his mates, Liam made a simple decision to switch from beer to vodka, lime and soda.
Liam's mum and dad, Tim and Lani Davies, they went, you know what, we're not letting our boy go and die and nothing become of this. We're going to make something of this. So they started what was called the Liam Foundation. The government connections they got via Indonesia, the connections through to the distillation associations and that, they went into a government root cause of the situation that nobody's ever dived in before. They were able to get laws changed, medical procedures changed.
The Liam charity has just had a huge win in Bali, with its health department signing the team's treatment guidelines into law.
They can now correctly treat people for methanol poisoning without fear of criminal charges.
They trained something like 7,000 staff, from nurses to doctors and that over there, in the hope that when you go to hospital and you need medical treatment, that you're going to get treated in the most efficient manner and you're going to have the best outcome for you to get home. Sadly, I think a lot of that has dropped over the last 5 or 10 years, to the point where I would say that in the last 4 or 5 years that I don't think nearly anybody that I've dealt with has been able to get a legitimate methanol poisoning test to prove or disprove the fact that they were poisoned. Whether that is through they don't want to implicate bars and businesses, whether it's a government doctrine being passed down where they say, you know what, if there's no methanol test that's positive, then there is no problem. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that just about everybody that I've dealt with that's had a very serious case and they've ended up going to hospital, none of them have been tested for methanol poisoning.
Information about this latest case is limited. Authorities in Laos are investigating but aren't providing many details. So it's unclear whether the victims who did make it to hospital were tested. What we do know is that at least 2 of the victims, a couple of young Danish women, never made it to a hospital. What we do know is that at least 2 of the victims, a couple of young Danish women, never made it to a hospital. They were found dead in their room at the Nana Backpackers Hostel.
Most people, you know, we try and solve our own bags of rubbish, our own scenarios. I would imagine that the girls were just going, you know what, this will get better, this will get better.
But it didn't get better, and many, like Erin Hale, wonder if generating more discussion around methanol and its fatal effects could have saved those 6 lives.
This is a problem, but I think it's not something that's widely advertised to backpackers. I would say is besides an information campaign, I would just advise them, talk to people who you meet there and ask them about what is this place's reputation. Some of the bar and hotel staff will be very nice and are extremely helpful. Or if you find a foreigner who's living there, you can also sort of ask around with them, because there'll be places that have a reputation, for being legit, and then there'll be places that have a reputation for oh yeah, that's like a frat bar. Watch yourself.
That's all for today. Thank you to Erin Hale, David Ranson and Colin Ahern. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite anō.